and welcome back to another episode of Leadership Lenses, podcast designed for principals, heads of school, Rosh Yeshiva, and anyone else interested in elevating, expanding, and enhancing Jewish education. I am thrilled to have with us here today, and I say this without exaggeration, one of the world's foremost experts on everything related to Jewish education, and modest, Dr. Alex Pomson, Principal and Managing Director of Rosov Consulting, with whom I have a long relationship and from whom I have learned a tremendous amount over the years. Thank you very much for joining us, Alex.
Barry, thank you for the chance to spend time schmoozing with you. Thank you. I mean, everything about Jewish education, that may be hyperbole. Happy to offer a perspective on some things.
Excellent. We'll let you off of like lunch menus and busing routes and even tuition collection. But in the actual learning part of Jewish education, I think we're doing pretty well. And on that learning note, I want to jump right in here. Rosov Consulting, under your guidance, put together a really wonderful piece of work. I think it was back in 2017, 2018 or so, that was done for Prisma. I know that you and Freda Gonchar, who is actually also an even older friend from Montreal, put together what you called the leadership learning landscape for principals and heads of school. And essentially, it was a project designed to determine what do Jewish educational leaders need to learn and what opportunities exist for them to do it, and how might we improve that field. And I think that frame, and it's one I refer to often in my work still, would be a really helpful starting place. So if you could just take us through, a little bit about that project and framework and help situate us, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Happy to kind of dig back into the archives, as it were, because I think that work has continued to be really important for more recent studies that my colleagues and I have engaged in this field. Essentially, the task was to map the landscape of leadership development programs in the field of Jewish education, or in fields that served Jewish educators or leaders of Jewish educational institutions. And a first order of business in that work was to recognize that we certainly didn't need to reinvent the wheel. Hundreds, if not thousands, of books and papers have been written about school leadership, educational leadership. And we began at that work, therefore, trying to bring some order or make some sense of the existing literature and look at that literature in ways that might be relevant and applicable to the field of Jewish education. And essentially, we identified a series of distinctions. First of all, at the broadest level, we noticed that kind of leadership development makes a distinction between, on the one hand, capacities, and on the other hand, dispositions, the cultivation of capacities and the cultivation of dispositions. Capacities is something that itself is often subdivided into a series of different realms. Capacities related to vision and direction setting, number one. Secondly, leadership or leadership capacities that are involved in personnel development and empowerment. Then kind of the organizational management pieces of leadership. Fourthly, instructional leadership. And finally, something that wasn't very visible in the broader literature, but is certainly of importance in parochial context and absolutely in the Jewish context, is leadership concerned with community building, both building community inside and outside one's own institutions. So 5 capacities, you could call them skills, but like things that can be learned and improved over time on the one hand, and those things we identified as dispositions that are very much integral to who the person is and less to what is it that they do. Of course, who I am has an impact on what I do, but it's very much about character traits, right? And that might be self-awareness, humility, creativity, and ambition. And for sure, those things can be nurtured, but they're very rarely taught in the same ways as the capacities are taught. And putting all of that together kind of gave us a map that allowed us to characterize, chart, document the emphases of the many programs that are serving leaders in the Jewish education field. Yes.
Okay, amazing. So, and what we will actually do for anybody who's listening and interested, we'll link to the PDF of that report, which is publicly available. And there's a beautiful chart laid out that shows you all of these pieces. Let's focus in on that distinction then between capacities and dispositions. And again, your capacities are things like vision and direction setting, people management, organizational management, instructional leadership, community building, stuff that we do, versus the dispositions, which is much more who we are. Broadly speaking, I guess the place I would start was, could you find any program that could teach or shift disposition, right? That took people who did not have charisma and helped them learn how to be charismatic leaders.
I don't know that there were programs that claimed or promised to cultivate different people or people who became something different as a result of their time in the program. But they did aspire to cultivate greater self-awareness about those dispositions, right? And create opportunities for people to work on such things themselves, right? So it's not as if a program would say, we commit to cultivating more empathetic school leaders, but we're going to shine a focus on the extent to which you are heightening your level of self-awareness about your own levels of empathy, right? With the hope that this might enable the dial to shift a little bit, let's say. Yeah.
Okay. And did it?
Okay. The good news for us is we were not in the business of evaluating the extent to which these programs did such things, right?
Okay.
We looked at the extent to which what they aspired to do, and to some extent what alumni of the programs felt they gained from such experiences. And I think without question, those programs probably did better at cultivating self-reflection and self-awareness. But I don't know that that anybody's really assessed such programs on the basis of whether they, let's say, intensify or heightens people's levels of ambition, result in people who are more honest or more trust building, people who have higher levels of integrity. I mean, like, those are things that are really very personal. Yeah.
Right. And would be extremely difficult to assess and evaluate. I
Yeah.
certainly would not, as a program leader, would not want to be evaluated on how I was
Yeah.
doing in that realm. But at the same time, it's helpful to understand that we do have professional development programs that are aiming on all those
Yeah.
levels. So the capacities level is where we might typically think about it, but the
Mhm.
dispositions level, and having spoken recently to some of the people who lead DSLTI, the Day School Leadership Training Institute, and actually Cheryl Mayan and Jane Tabin-Feldkohn, who are both very involved there, have
Mhm.
been previous guests. And so we've heard a little bit about the program. They seek to cultivate the sort of self-reflection and thought processes that might lead one to become a more empathic or any other self-development aspect of leadership.
Mhm. I think that's right.
And one more question on this, and then I want to shift, because I know you've done some new work on the
Mhm.
teacher side, which would be great for heads and principals to
Mhm.
understand. But did you come out with any sense of how these kinds of programs are fit to purpose? In other words, if I'm a leader and I'd like to develop myself, and I think I might have a weakness in area A, B, or C, be it capacity or disposition, what did you learn about what kinds of programs leaders ought to be looking for in order to achieve their own development goals?
That's a very interesting question. So, look, unfortunately, I don't think many leaders have the opportunity to rigorously and systematically assess what program A is offering relative to program B to determine whether one rather than the other is better suited to their current learning needs. Perhaps some do that in consultation with a leadership coach, but I think more often than not, people arrive at the decision to sign up for or apply to programs based on the prestige of what those, the perceived prestige of those programs, or simply at the recommendation of a peer or mentor that, oh, this would be a great opportunity for you to pursue. So there's a lot of serendipity about how people arrive at such places, and maybe that's best in that, you bring a friend or refer a friend, and hopefully your friend or peer will be well matched to something that you yourself have experienced and benefited from. And it's very rare, like, it's not like choosing where should we go out to eat tonight. Well, let's look at all of those menus and then decide which is best suited to our particular tastes. It tends to be less predictable, more socially influenced, and more opportunistic, essentially.
That's great. No, so just one piece there, and then I promise we'll go on to the teacher side. You mentioned leadership coaching. So when I'm not podcasting, a lot of the time that I spend professionally is as a coach for heads, principals, executive directors. The world of leadership coaching is very close to my heart. And I'm curious if you had any either insightful, powerful, interesting findings as you surveyed leadership coaching as one of these pathways, or if you did, that are relevant for heads to know. Either heads who might be working with a coach or not working and thinking about working with a coach.
Right. So it's interesting. I mean, that study specifically looked at programs and didn't look at leadership coaches as an alternative to programs, right? I think if we were to do that work today, do it again, I think we would really have to consider leadership coaching as a really component on the leadership learning landscape that we would have to consider. Of course, okay, some coaches kind of hang the shingle that says, and here's what I can promise you, in the same way that some programs do, right? But it's obviously a much more fragmented field, and there are many more, call it program or content providers in the leadership, in the coaching landscape than there are in the program landscape. So that would be a harder task. But I think that piece I just mentioned before about the coach as facilitator of program choices is also something we didn't pay enough close attention to, and really would be considering if we were to do that work again. Yeah.
Right. And that makes sense. And your consideration of that, I think, also parallels with what I've seen in terms of the ever growing percentage of heads and principals who are working with a coach, which I celebrate. And I celebrated even before I was a coach, because it's an exceedingly lonely job and it's an exceedingly challenging job. Obviously, there are many, many wonderful, I don't mean to say anything negative, but a fulfilling and also emotionally taxing job where you often have no local colleagues. In that sort of situation, a coach can really be a lifeline and tremendously helpful and supportive. So let's shift now. And I understand from you that you've been doing some work recently around understanding the landscape of teacher professional development, and orient us to that field to begin with before we go a little bit deeper.
Sure. So this is ongoing work, now currently in its third year, made possible by the Jim Joseph Foundation. And the team at Rosov Consulting have really been helping the foundation, let's say, document and then hopefully ultimately assess the contribution of those programs that operate within what the foundation calls its EJLE portfolio, the portfolio dedicated to cultivating exceptional Jewish leaders and educators. So this is where the work on leadership kind of blurs into or runs into the work on educators more generally. Educators are across the field of Jewish education. But in our study, we've kind of identified, well, I'll get to that. Let me stop myself for a second and say that this work, this EJLE work, really has two strands to it. In the first place, and maybe more mundane, is we are simply conducting an audit of the profiles of the educators who participate in program offerings provided by 15 different organizations that are located within this part of the foundation's portfolio. organizations that offer professional development to Jewish leaders and educators, running the gamut from Birthright. I don't think there's any program that begins with an A. Actually, Utra, Birthright, all the way through to, and now I'm going to get myself into trouble because I'm trying to think of like Wexner towards the other end of the alphabet. If there's any program beyond XYZ, I don't know. But either way, there's programs really across the gamut of Jewish education, some that exclusively serve the day school field, such as the Jewish New Teacher Project and Prisma, and some that serve multiple fields, such as M Squared and the Jewish Education Project. So one piece of that work is simply auditing in a systematic fashion for the first time ever the demographic profiles of who's participating in this program. The second piece of this, and in many ways way more ambitious and really interesting, is to have recruited alumni from those 15 program providers to participate in a long-term, longitudinal panel that would allow us to follow alumni of those programs over time as their careers develop and as they themselves grow and maybe don't grow as Jewish educators and Jewish educational leaders, right? So that work has required us to conceptualize, again, what might be the desired outcomes of professional development in the field of Jewish education and in the field of Jewish educational leadership, and then attempt to track changes in the profiles of, or changes in the participants of these programs or alumni of these programs in relation to those dimensions that we identify. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an orientation.
Yeah. Okay, so that is a huge, vast, and deep dive into professional development and professional learning. And while I look forward to seeing the longitudinal results, they probably won't be available before we end this session. So I'm curious as to what you've learned so far. And I know this, and I'll frame this in terms of principals and heads of school who have a limited professional development budget and, broadly speaking, would like to see their faculty grow, develop, enhance their skills in a range of areas. We know we have some sense of best practices, but I'm sure there's more to learn. And I'm curious what you've learned about what tends to make an impact and how.
Right. So these are very early days. As I said, we've been doing this work for 3 years, and I think I said 3 years. We've been gathering data for 2 years, and the data we have collected so far has been really striking in terms of where we see greatest change over time in this longitudinal sample, a sample made up of some 600 educators. What we see change in some places and no change in others. When I say places, I mean change in some dimensions of professional practice and competence. And well, let me get to the point here in terms of, again, going back to the reason why we started the conversation with that other study is because we've made a distinction here between what we call dispositions, again, right? What we call personal experience and meaning, which is a kind of blended or gray area between what we previously called dispositions and capacities, right? And then something we call professional contribution and connectivity, which is broadly what we once called capacities, right? And so to give you some examples, is like at the least end of the spectrum, in other words, where we have seen minimal change is in relation to dispositions. Take an example, the disposition of grit, people's perseverance and passion towards long-term goals. That's how Eleanor Duckworth defines grit. And we have observed no change, really no meaningful change in the population we're studying over time in relation to that particular disposition. Whereas over on the other end of the spectrum, what we previously called capacities, and what we're calling here professional contribution and connectivity, we noticed tremendous variation from one year to the next in the scores, in the metrics associated with people's contribution to, or let's say, their initiating and implementation of change and collaboration in their own workplaces or in their sustaining of networks or support groups and exchange with fellow professional peers. So what we're observing is, to kind of go up to 10,000 feet here for a moment, it seems as if there are some features of what it is, of who educators are and of what they are able to do that are much more amenable, much more receptive to efforts to change them than others, which seem pretty much locked in by the time we become adults and certainly by the time we become educators.
That's fascinating. And so something along the lines of my self-conception of who I am, my tendency towards grit, empathy, perhaps certain ways that I see the world or assumptions I have about people as a teacher are much, much more challenging to change. But my ability to, let's say, employ differentiated instruction in a classroom or move to project-based learning or any of those other skill-oriented show much more development over time.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And here's the challenge, because we did an informal exercise with the providers of professional development where we asked them, like, look at our framework and tell us which of these things do you seek to cultivate as, through your programs. And pretty much all of them do seek to cultivate dispositional change, right?
Right.
And foremost among those is something like curiosity and exploration.
Being a lifelong learner.
Yep, that's right. But being a lifelong learner requires a certain disposition to an appetite for learning and a curiosity about learning. And what we found in this very limited frame of time that we've been looking at these things, I really want to condition everything I'm saying on the very short timeline that we have been working with here. And the picture may change over the next 5 years as the foundation is interested in us continuing to explore these things, right? So that may change, but within the framework of time 1 and time 2, data we collected in 2024 and data we collected in 2025, there are some things that don't seem to change very much. And those are often the things that we want our educators to develop. We want them to operate with a growth mindset and to be curious and to have a sense of self as leader or educator, right? Those are the things that seem to be most resistant to change, or that, and you could argue this differently, or are not currently being exposed to experiences or interventions that would cause them to change.
Right. Given the breadth of programs you're serving, if they're not currently being exposed, it's not one particular program. This is a broad phenomenon. And it almost would seem to say to me, if I'm advising a head of school, look, your goal shouldn't be to create lifelong learners. Your goal should be to equip teachers with the skills you'd like them to employ this year. I might make an argument that over time, a certain number of skills, like the old character argument, right? If we teach you enough traits over time, you'll develop character. Perhaps if we enable you to learn enough different pedagogic skills over time, you'll become more curious. But that's not really what I should be aiming at, not the curiosity. I need to be aiming at, we're trying to create this kind of pedagogy, and that's much more likely for you to be able to develop through a structured program.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and those kinds of aspirations that you just described may almost sound a bit mundane, right? Relative to some of those higher order aspirations, but they're probably more realistic aspirations for leaders to have of their, of what they can expect to cultivate, at least in the near term, among those they supervise. I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm actually reminded of a line that Brene Brown quotes in her most recent book from James March, where he suggests that leadership is part plumbing and part poetry. And to put what you're saying in slightly different terms, it's not so much fun to focus on the plumbing. And I know when I was at school, I'd much rather say, we're enabling educators, we're enabling our teachers to become lifelong learners filled with curiosity who are going to inspire our students. That's much more attractive and looks much better on a brochure. But if I actually want teachers to be able to do something different, ensuring they learn the nuts and bolts of a particular approach, even if it's a broad approach, but there are some skills and capacities within that, that's much more likely to be successful. It's the plumbing. It's not as attractive. It's not as poetic, but it may be what gets the job done.
I think that's right. I mean, we do all aspire to be poets, or some of us do anyway, right?
Yes.
But if the pipes are leaking around us, we are not going to be able to write any poetry if our feet are wet. So, I mean, we could play with this
Yes.
metaphor. I mean, I'd say one additional thing is that, and again, this is really emergent data, right? Very interim, to say the least, is that another piece of what we have seen to be highly variable, even within the span of 12, say 16 months, have been the consequences of circumstances in educational institutions. So measures of the quality of people's relationships with their supervisors, right, indicate high levels of variation, both positive and negative, from one year to the next, or people's level of career satisfaction, primarily satisfaction with the places in which they work. Also, some level of variability, both positive and negative, from one year to the next. Those are all consequences of the plumbing, as you put it, right? Those are things that school leaders can influence uh, um, quite immediately, actually, and certainly more readily than cultivating a growth mindset or grit and motivation, career motivation in those that they supervise.
Right. Right. And one last thought, and then I'll let you have the closing word. But to me, one of the other reasons that as a school leader we don't emphasize those technical aspects as much is that it feels more top down. We are ensuring that you become able to use differentiated instructional techniques or whatever else it might be, whereas enabling you to develop a grit mindset feels more enabling, empowering, bottom up.
Right.
And I don't know that it needs to be that way. Because the skills and capacities that teachers have are still an art, right? And I don't remember the source for this quote, but that education is perhaps the last art among the liberal arts in any college program. I think that's true, and that means that if we teach you how to do your brush strokes better, then that's not necessarily regimented and top down and limiting. It can be empowering and enabling by developing the skills you need to then apply your own poetry as a teacher.
Right. I mean, I think perhaps the most satisfying and nourishing dimension of work as an educator is the sense of making a difference in people's lives. And if by adjusting the temperature and adjusting the plumbing or helping people to make such adjustments, we enable them to contribute more broadly and more deeply to people's lives, they probably will find poetry in that, right? That will probably be deeply meaningful. And I think it's about creating the opportunities for people to kind of experience the ultimate, as it were, taste those or bring to, realize those ultimate goals that they have as educators. And we have to pay attention to the circumstances and conditions in which people do their work and the ways we can help them realize those, the highest aspirations by means of paying attention to the mundane.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This has been a pleasure. I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to hold now. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you for the opportunity to share what I have to emphasize is emergent work.
Well, we will take it as such, and yet we still need to know what to do tomorrow. So we will take it as such and still learn from it, and would love to see it develop and look forward to seeing the various reports and findings that you're able to share when you do. And in the meantime, as I always end here, I encourage people to try it out. Yes, it's emergent. It's not final, but you might as well try it out and see how it goes. See what difference it makes when you as a principal think carefully about what kinds of professional development you're offering and where you might be able to make the biggest difference for your teachers so that they can make the biggest difference for their students. So as you try it out, please feel free to reach out to us anytime. Alex graciously offers to be in touch with those who have further questions for him, and you can get his contact on his website, rosovconsulting.com. And as always, you can reach me at Barry Kislowitz on LinkedIn, Leadership Lenses on Substack, or on our website, kislowitzconsulting.com. Thank you very much.